Today is February 12th. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Naganago, Meko Che, Stokom, Aki. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. Native Calgarian is being recorded on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the opposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bogani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw nations of the Stoney, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with government signing on your behalf. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been so kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name. I was born in Calgary or in Blackfoot, Mohkinstsis, as Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. My father is so Canadian, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution while having an Indian Act imposed status card. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Hare people, also called the Great Bear Lake people in Treaty 11. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is a visitor to this area of Clincho Tine Indahe in Dene, meaning many horse town, named after the Calgary Stampede. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous. I just share what I know as I walk my red road. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. Also, giving a review helps, whichever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel where you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And today I'm so lucky to have my friend Devon join me. Devon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Devon Hargreaves in Lethbridge, Alberta on Treaty 7 lands. We go back a long way, I'd say, provincial politics, federal, and past candidate for the Liberal Party for the riding in Lethbridge. And yeah, happy to be here. We've had many great discussions offline and can't wait to see what comes up today.
Right, and another win in your hat, I think, is the conversion therapy ban petition that you had got started. And yeah, Matt and I talked in the last episode, and I was trying to explain to him how hostile Tabor was and putting together that and you know what it's really like to be in Alberta. But I think over the last couple of days, a lot of Canada's kind of gotten a better taste of what it's like to be in Alberta.
Yeah, I think at least the Lethbridge riding is quite progressive, but politics is a pendulum and it swings left to right at times. And I think with a lot of the rhetoric that we saw out of the States over the past presidency really escalated kind of that far right swing in Alberta, and I'd go so far as to say Canada, and it's disheartening to watch. I don't think it speaks for the majority, but it's the aggressiveness that they're coming forward with that we are seeing, and it does paint us with a bad brush.
Oh, awful. A lot of folks out now in Ottawa today, though, are starting to breathe a little easier. It looks like on Twitter that a lot of these folks were asked to go home and are indeed picking up their tents and their trucks and heading back here to Alberta. So I think, you know, Alberta might look a little different, but because I, as far as I know, all of the convoys that are still planned to go from all around the province to the legislature are still a go this weekend. And the Coots border still sounds like it's closed. So Alberta, obviously a very different ball of wax than the rest of the country is experiencing. I think Manitoba has a border now being shut down. So I'll be curious to see if the RCMP do some work there too. I don't know.
I think a large part of the responsibility at Coutts does fall squarely on the provincial government. The border itself is fine. The highway is a provincial jurisdiction. We see in Ontario that they are stepping up. They did send the police in to clear the Ambassador Bridge, but that's due to the steps the province took with a state of emergency and things like that. And we have a provincial government that doesn't like to take responsibility, as we're quite both well aware, and in fact played into that sentiment that allowed a blockade to happen.
So I think it was in 2011, I did a book club with Marcy McDonald's book about the road to Armageddon, and it talked about the rise of Christian nationalism and conservative politics in both the US and Canada. And it was Danielle Smith. She talked about what it was like going to those camps. So basically, for folks who don't know, conservatives federally and provincially have been going down to the States to these conservative Christian camps. And I think on air, she said her breaking point was their pro-life stance, right? So they're libertarian up to the point of controlling women. So of course she was like, oh, I'm out of here, and she left. But the point is that radicalization of conservative politics and that seeping into Canadian politics from American sources, that's been ongoing. And of course, the pandemic with People's Guards down obviously brought that up, and the willful denial by progressive Canadians about the extreme racism has just been so over the top. It's actually been very difficult for me to watch the gaslighting from progressives, frankly. So I think that there's a huge awakening from folks of how bad it's been, and the silencing of QT BIPOC for up to now. So I'm hoping that people will start fighting a little more for their democracy in a better way. But it's really hard because, like, I was just talking to my dad, and he's like lecturing me on things that I know that I'm like on the record talking about years before the pandemic, and people just they're not paying attention. They weren't aware. They didn't know the seniors crisis that was happening in the lodges and then on the hospitals and the strain on healthcare. No concept of any of it.
For sure, yeah. And well, you and I both have been talking for many years about a wide array of topics that we're really seeing come to the forefront right now. And it's just that fact that you see it, you talk about it, and people take it for granted. Yep. One thing I know you talk about a lot is just how racism can be subtle. We both have our own racism to some extent or other. And I think this rise of the far right, the rise of the neo-Nazism in some cases, it comes in so subtly that people say, well, we'll excuse that, that's not so bad, and then it will end up like we're seeing now with flying the swastika on Parliament Hill. And yeah, it's really a shame to watch. One really interesting thing that came out over the last bit with Aaron O'Toole stepping down was that the alleged rumor, I'll word it that way, that he was driven out over supporting the ban on conversion therapy. I know our own member of parliament here in Lethbridge voted against it previously and was on the news within days to very proudly announce that she was one of the initial signatories that helped drive O'Toole out of leadership. And I really hope that that's not a foreshadowing of things to come with a certain political party, that it does push it further right. But I guess time will tell.
It is going right, though. Like here out in Alberta, like we have the Maverick Party, which was funded by this U.S. Trump Magda group, causing this entire convoy. And now the riding associate, or whatever her role in this party was, has gone missing with the GoFundMe. Like it's so incredible to me how everybody was, investigating Indigenous to be, are we being funded by some foreign entity? And I've never gotten a check from George Soros or any of these other so-called funders, foreign funders. And ironically, like anyone who's ever worked in oil and gas knows that all the oil and gas is still funded and funneled through the US. So it's only like, satellite companies that are in Canada. And because they fall under Canadian jurisdiction, they can use Canadian law to somehow kill Indigenous people globally into different countries where they're indigenous people. So like, the Brazil, the Colombias, there's no care for human rights, even though ironically we champion ourselves as a human rights country.
It's another thing that really jumped out to me. You might have saw I posted kind of a tongue-in-cheek post on Facebook about these convoys and the anti-vax movement that they've, and I don't agree that it is a human rights issue, but they've pegged it as a human rights issue. But at what point have we ever seen any support for any of the causes that either of us have done when it actually entailed human rights? It entails missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, conversion therapy, anything along those lines. When have we seen that support? And to pretend that it's something that they've always been passionate about is kind of hypocritical.
Oh, it's ridiculous. I think everybody's seen it now. Like even white people are like, yeah, these are pretty big kid gloves the police are using. And somehow Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau, completely different, ideological political beliefs, but they definitely are united, and we don't hurt white people. So, it's been really difficult for us to watch, because if it's like every year the Wet'suwet'en are attacked, like armed attacked, they are living in their homes with their families, and elders and children are being violently, guns pointed at them by the RCMP, and everybody's okay with it. And there isn't this public outcry, and there certainly isn't $10 million going into the tiny homes fund. And speaking of which, it's the 12th of February, which means that on Valentine's Day, while a lot of people are going out for dinner, it's actually marches that we do nationally to honor all of it's supposed to be all women that have been murdered in the course of a year. But because mainly Indigenous women lead them, it talks a lot about missing and murdered Indigenous women as well. And, at the end of the day, I do wish more people would, go to our Valentine's Day marches, our Valentine's Day vigils, and participate in that. But ironically, all these freedom fighters are not going to be at them. They never have been. And even some of their leaders are now claiming indigeneity, which they very well may, but they haven't had a lifelong struggle of, oppression because of their indigeneity. And that's the ironic part, when people claim indigeneity long after the part where they've already, benefited from stolen land and imposed economy, and now they're suddenly Indigenous. And it's so insulting and hurtful for those of us actually who are Indigenous and trying to reclaim what's been stolen from us. These are things that I am seeing so painfully clear, and people have the audacity to claim to me they care about reconciliation, but they don't fund us. We have Marilyn North Pagin, she's running again, only this time for the NDP nomination. And, again, people claim they want systemic changes, but they don't volunteer for her, donate to her, nothing. Just like that was my experience as well. And, I just am so sad to see it, because people claim they're not racist, but they allow this white supremacy to grow and grow and grow. And it's so in your face. And we have all these reports and calls to action, calls to justice, and nobody's, doing the work. And the Conservative Party have never had a platform for any of these things that I've been talking about. So they don't care about our rights. They only care about white rights. And that's why they're always in pictures with Nazis, and pictures with Proud Boys, and pictures with the 3%ers, or whatever the racist white supremacist group is of the day, supporting convoy, which had swastikas and, libertarian flags and all sorts of crap down there that are ridiculous. But everybody in Canada has accepted it for so long. And I will never understand this, claim to care about human rights.
Sure. And I will point out, I do agree with the right to protest. I understand that not everyone who goes to these protests is in support of Nazi rights or flying those flags. But once you allow that into your movement, it poisons it. If you really disagree with that, step up, make sure that they know that that's not welcome. Make sure that rhetoric is not welcome. Make sure that you are abiding by the laws of the land. I think we've seen too many blind eyes turned, where not all of us are like that, but some are. And if Nazis are feeling comfortable in your movement, then you may want to reconsider, and you may want to make sure that they know that they're not. Going back to your nomination you're working on. That was fun during my last federal election. You were all over the place, and I recall you were working on Maryland's run for city council at the same time. You're amazing. I don't know how you did it. You hit Calgary, you hit Lethbridge. I think you went out to Medicine Hat all in one day.
I did. Well, at the time I thought I could, and obviously now I'm paying in droves for it. But it's one of those things that at the time things felt like I could do those things, and now I can't. And now I'm having a hard time just leaving my house even. And but I also just had COVID, and I'm not 100%. I haven't been 100% since I was sick before COVID, so it's been really a hard time. And even the move to Lethbridge was tough. But obviously we're back here in Calgary and trying to. We still haven't got unemployment, if you can believe it. Thank God, Darcy found a job, but Jesus, it's so depressing because the socioeconomic stats prove it. Indigenous women are at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, and Two-Spirits aren't even really classified because they can't seem to study it, and so they're even lower than Indigenous women. And it's
Well, people like
true.
boxes, right? And so there's room made on paper for Indigenous or for people a part of the LGBTQ2 plus community, but when you have that intersectionality, really confuses the boxes. And it's great to see so many organizations, so many companies stepping up and making
no, they're not.
efforts.
They're not. I'm telling you, Devon.
That's why I say on paper.
Yeah.
We can talk about how we want even more pay equality between men and women. And when it actually comes down to it, there's ways to circumvent that and to give that image. It's like during Pride Month, every company out there will fly a rainbow flag or put out a product with a rainbow on it. But it's what you do outside of June. It's what you do outside of these big months or these reconciliation attempts or inclusivity attempts that actually makes that difference.
Yeah, I know. And I'm still not seeing it. I'm not seeing it at all. So anyway, my point with bringing that up was more that, because you can be paid minimum wage, you get paid minimum wage, and there's nobody still advocating to change that. And Two-Spirit, of course, are even lower on that scale because of the lack of opportunity for Indigenous people, let alone that intersectionality of LGBTQ2+. So the trauma that goes along with being in this world is not made for us. And as you know, in Alberta, we've been slowly cutting mental health to the point that there is none. And so there's no alternatives for us, and there's certainly no culturally appropriate alternatives for us. And prior to the pandemic, I was trying to work on that, but I can't do that now that I'm in this position where I need the services as opposed to be giving them. So it's such a weird moment in my life right now. I never expected to be here, but I think it's important that non-Indigenous understand the plight. Like when I open up my Facebook, all I see are people who are having economic problems or deaths. And you're not seeing that in the white community. So that's why everybody's okay with all these trucker convoys, because wearing a mask has been too much for them, even though our people are dying. And the Indigenous doctors in health, they knew that, and they advocated for us to have vaccines first. But I can tell you, whenever I went to a white AHS clinic, I experienced questioning that I never experienced when I went to the Aboriginal Friendship Center's vaccine clinic. So it's the racism is everywhere, and the lack of healthcare is everywhere. And one of the things that I do appreciate being back in Calgary for was there was no doctors in Lethbridge, none. And the one I have here, like, she's a woman of color, ironically, but she has anti-Indigenous bias. So I'm not getting proper health care, and I'm not getting proper diagnosis about what's wrong with me. And I know that, white women, they get proper health care compared to non-Indigenous. And an example is that my friend he talks about it openly, how his partner's mom and his mom had the exact same diagnosis, but because the white mom's diagnosis was caught sooner, she was able to get healthcare and get past it, as opposed to Indigenous women who get marginalized, and she died. So
I think it's uncomfortable to talk about. It's something that doesn't fit into this narrative. Again, even with corporations, with government, where we all want to appear to be inclusive, and it's easy to turn a blind eye to that. It's an uncomfortable topic to address and deal with. So I really thank you. You've educated me a great deal too. You had the partner of an individual who passed away on the show to share his story about that racism in the healthcare system, and that was I cried listening to that episode. That was a real emotional one. And I really thank you for the work that you have done to educate. And again, you put yourself out there, you do all this work, and then you turn around and post screenshots of the messages you get sent. It's
yeah, some of them are funny. I mean, actually comical. But like, people in real life say that to me too. Like, when I quit my job, I got told, well, I thought you were a fighter. And I thought, wow, tell me you don't understand without telling me you don't understand. No concept at all. What she had said to me was awful. And but it's that power dynamic of the boss is used to talking down to their employees, and it just makes me so sad, because I know, like, there were so many things I seen that no one should have to endure, let alone there's no accountability or security. So that was actually some things I wanted to talk to you about, now that I've seen firsthand some of how registries work. Man, we got work to do. So I know mental health isn't something that Albertans seem to care about, but until it affects them directly. But for the trans community, so the RCMP have to do fingerprinting for a person to transition, so that they have the fingerprints of before and after their dead name compared to their new name. And that's an expensive process. All of the ID changes, that's an expensive process. These are things that I think should be covered under Alberta healthcare at the very minimum, or some type of programming. I know Skipping Stone here in Calgary has been trying to do that type of work, but like, it's overwhelming. And then the amount of permissions that you need from parents, and as you know, not all parents are going to be okay with that. And I think the education to the general public to understand how hard it is to get the doctors to go through the process with you to even transition. Like, that's not something that's easy to do. And a lot of people don't have that kind of healthcare that they can even access it. And, so that there's so much work to do there. And then the worst part is constantly denying people who need healthcare because they didn't have the right paperwork. So the Alberta government doesn't accept SIN numbers, SIN addresses, mailed SIN, and now even confirmation letters for permanent residency status for driver's license, et cetera, et cetera. And like, these are huge barriers of not having enough ID. And then I was actually on a community conversation with Bear Clan and with Taylor McNally of Inclusive Canada. We were talking about ID, and I was telling them what it's like being on the other end of it, seeing all of these resources going towards ID programs that at the end of the day, between the shelters or the police arresting, all those IDs go in the garbage, whether it's stolen at a shelter or whether it's stolen by the police when they take it. So then all of this money going into these nonprofits that are doing ID clinics and ID programs are like literally easily preventable things, had they had like a locked locker, if they had a million things that we could, options instead. And I'm just so sad, because you can't get healthcare without certain IDs, and that's wrong too. Yeah, it was really eye-opening.
And it's been an ongoing issue. I, of course, moved to Lethbridge in 2011, but before that, I was in Fort McMurray, and I did a lot of work with our downtown population. I couldn't imagine minus 40 that regularly and not having a fixed address. But that lack of ID, that the difficulty in obtaining an ID, or to, well, if you lose or have your wallet stolen with your ID, your healthcare card number, social insurance, because you have to carry everything you have with you. You lose that. And to try to get any of those again, to even access healthcare properly, to even get mail, try to find employment without a fixed address and not being able to afford a cell phone, or,
Yep.
And then you can use the drop-in center, but they call there and find that out, then they're going to have those preconceived notions of what kind of person you are, and it's difficult to watch. And yeah, I'm sure you've got a lot more of an inside scoop on that now from your.
Yeah, I just don't know if I recommend it to anybody. It was hard on the heart. And new immigrants, like new refugees, new folks that are coming here. Like if you're a refugee, you have no paperwork. I mean, you have tiny bit of paperwork, but we don't accept any of that. And Jason Kenney was immigration minister. He purposely put up barriers that I don't even know. So these are things that have been really weighing on my heart, the amount of people walking around with us with no health care. And ironically, I mean, then there's the other side of it where you don't want to judge people's life choices, but perfectly capable, able-bodied folks who had every reason to transfer their healthcare or their insurance registration, anything over from Saskatchewan, BC, and they just chose not to, and then everything's expired, and then they're the ones who get mad at us the loudest for not accommodating them. And ironically, like I got COVID, and a lot of our staff did, and there's no safety there. And I mean, you're hearing the nurses talking, or the teachers specifically talking about that right now. Because like 5 and under, they don't have vaccines, and just because you're 5 and over doesn't mean your parents were into giving you one either. So we're in a real predicament here where a lot of the teachers, I think, are going to be exposed to the disease, like it or not. And yeah, it's just too bad that they decided not to slowly back off on certain things. And ironically, that these mandates were just, they were recommendations, guidelines, really. Like there wasn't really severe consequences to a lot of not following it. I mean, I walk around Calgary and I see especially men with their masks under their nose. And I just think you did 99% of the work. You literally just have to pop it over your nose. That's it. That's all. So yeah, it's been really eye-opening.
Yeah, it sure has. One thing I think I really want to see come out of, and this is a little off where we just were, but
sure,
kind of. After this pandemic, I think we need to do a lot more work as far as accessibility, as far as accommodations. I think the vast majority of people staying at home, working from home, meetings moving to online, things like that really showed what is possible. And technology has been there for a while, but not utilized as much. I would much rather be face-to-face with you right now, but we're in 2 different cities and able to communicate this way as far as working on policy, as far as advocacy and moving forward. I think it's kind of opened up a new horizon of where we're able to go.
I've been advocating in the party for forever. I'm like, if you could just have an online option to participate in some of these policy discussions and, participating in conventions, not only would it be a better eco footprint that we're leaving behind, but also be more inclusive. And, if you drop the registration from, ridiculous amounts to something lower, you probably would have more people coming anyway, because they want to come. They just don't have access to jumping on a plane and spending $3,000 to go to Halifax or whatever, right? So,
and getting the time off work, it can be limiting. And from what I'm aware, there are online options being looked at, and I hope that continues into the future, not just in this, but in all sorts of ways. I think people with chronic health conditions, people that are sick, and we fought so much for paid sick time, things like that. But just that ability, if you have a cold, to stay at home and work from home. I understand not all jobs allow for that. A mechanic cannot work from home like some others may be able to, but where it is possible, I think we need to start seeing more accommodations and more leeway. And I think it leads to better mental health for people. I think it leads to just that knowing that there is more support. And I think it would go a long way. One thing we found when we did our conversion therapy campaign is that, and I won't name the name of it, there's an online petition platform that is widely used that really doesn't stand up to the federal government. They do have their online petition source, which is where we launched our petition, 18,200 signatures coast to coast. Why doesn't Alberta in 2022 have an online source to petition our provincial government? We wonder why our voting rates are going down, why more young people aren't getting involved, yet we still expect for any say in the government for someone to have to take that time to go around with a clipboard and get signatures that match. Again, if you don't have a proper address, that makes it very difficult for the government to take your signature seriously. And like I said, it's 2022. Why can't we petition our provincial government online? If they even want to do it with recall legislation, I think that could be very interesting to see where that went. We're in a pandemic. I don't think it's particularly wise to be going door to door with shared paper and pens.
I know.
Let's increase accessibility and get more young people, more people that can't make it out involved in the process and having a say. And I'm completely fine. A provincial online petition system should have rules and restrictions of how it's done so that it can't just be co-opted by people that aren't in the province. And it, of course, has to be respectful, follow proper
I'm going to tell you a story. So when I was drafting Wells and Pipelines, Spin 2 is the main government system that really holds all the land titles that everybody knows about. And they did a big system upgrade in about 2003, something like that. I remember it because I was working. And then when we got into it, it didn't look like it had changed at all. And seeing the RCMP fingerprinting software, from the Liberal Party, the software that we use for Revenue Canada, like these are all ancient software pieces, all of it. And they have no intention of upgrading any of this stuff. And that's the problem, is that our government is not maintaining and not staying on top of the technological advances that we could have. And they're so difficult to change. So I agree with you. I can't agree with you more, but I mean, this was long before the pandemic, talking about making our conventions more accessible, and there being so much opposition to it. And I think that, we just see that in government in general, where they're just not just like 20 years behind, like 30 years behind in software. I mean, when I was growing up and we were first introduced to computers, that's still the type of software we're using for Revenue Canada. And I don't know what to say, my friend. I think that we think because of movies and media that our governments are staying on top of this and have the best of the best of the best, and ironically they don't. And I think you see that with the ambulance service, for example, where they're using old GIS as opposed to modern Google Maps, where you and I know I can go to Google Maps and find out the bus system better than on Calgary Transit, because they're just not willing to adapt.
Yeah, things changed fast. During my last election, we were out on the west side of Lethbridge there, and input the address. That gave us a marker, but it didn't have the streets yet even. So times are changing fast, and adaptability definitely does have to be something that we go with. But I am kind of sarcastic here, but does it really surprise us that our provincial government is 20 to 30 years behind?
Well,
look at the policy coming from them.
Honestly, I feel like they're trying to go backwards, like, obviously with their curriculum, talking about pen and paper when I'm talking about computers. I don't even know what, like, I don't know how to speak that dumb frankly, I don't know how to come down to that level and understand where they're coming from at all. And she's an education minister. And, you know, as much as you and I can laugh, which is true and it's hysterical, but at the end of the day, our voters are freedom convoy folks. They are of that intellect where they don't understand the education system. They don't understand the computer system. They don't know the barriers people are experiencing. And I heard this really cynical post, and it basically said the reason why people want to end the mandates and employers want employees back into their offices so that they can control them better, you know, so that managers can justify their, you know, micromanaging, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, as cynical as that take is, that sounds like capitalism at its finest. So, you know, I'm not going to discount it. I'd love to make a world that is, you know, more accessible. And the disability community's been advocating for this long before we ever were, for the convention even, because I'm able-bodied, so I don't even know all the barriers that people are facing, and I get to hear about it second, third hand at times, and I don't know. Now, ironically, for folks who believe in money, 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 capitalism, fiscal responsibility, they would make more money by being more accessible. And ironically, they still won't change. And that is something I cannot wrap my head around.
Yeah, well, it's not something that's easy to explain, but processes get set and people like to follow them, and change can be difficult.
So difficult. So in a better world, I'd love to see that, and I'd love to see, you know, for the structures to change. And it's really hard because, like, I was listening to CBC, and their economist yesterday morning was touting. I couldn't believe he said these words. He's like, well, nowadays, you know, you can basically write what you want, and then you can get a job there. And I'm like, I don't know what job market this guy's looking at, but that's not the job market in Calgary today. You know, I'm having a hard time finding a job that I'm more than qualified for. You know, and it's hard when you get those rejection letters. It sucks. But it is what it is.
If you even hear back.
If you hear back at all, exactly. And I've been debating that. Like, is hearing back at all when you know you're not even being considered, is like that better than getting the rejection letter? Because the rejection letters don't give you any guidance. They just say, no, you're not considered for whatever, you know, we found a better candidate. That's almost always what they say. So you know, and that constant rejection. And I mean, my husband was dealing with it for a year, when he first lost his job. And then when he found this job that took us to Lethbridge, I mean, it sounded so great.
You got my hopes up for a bit there. We've had coffee over Zoom before. We've chatted, we've messaged, and I was like, we're going to be able to actually have coffee together.
Hang out, maybe even have a hot tub together.
Exactly.
Oh,
Darcy play with my big dog.
We were so close. Oh my God. I remember the weekend before Darcy got laid off, it was my first weekend. I just relaxed for the first time in months of moving. And, you know, we had a bid on the house, and he was happy at work, and things seemed okay. Whew. And then, man, and I've been really grateful for my treadmill. I think that's the only thing that kept my body from having an actual heart attack. And I'm only now starting to come down a little, but I don't feel safe. It's going to take a few more months of things before I feel safe, because we're still not financially secure. But I can't take that job not for another minute. It was really bad, and I felt really bad for the employees that continue there. I don't think, like, I've been trying to think, like, do you unionize the registries? Because I don't think you can get buy-in there. But the safeguards, like, I think everyone needs a commissioner, a security guard sitting at the door. I can't believe how violent people were getting. And, well, I can, but you know what I mean, where it's like, well, this is the government of Alberta. You think that people would be better, but it was like the excuse to be worse. And, you know, maybe that one was different because it was downtown, but holy.
Well, and this government has always liked to put it onto the, for lack of a better term, the little people. We expect servers to enforce mask mandates and not expect the police to come when they're called to enforce that. We
Right.
expect them to be checking red deer. They said they were showing pictures of puppies and getting let in instead of the restriction exemptions program at a certain place. The employer turned around and blamed the 15 or 16-year-old working the front.
I read that.
And it's, yeah, if this government had been more clear provincially on what the restrictions were, what was expected, and what was being done to enforce that, it would have taken a lot more pressure off of our small businesses that frankly have suffered extensively throughout this.
Well, and now the drop of all the mandates makes these positions even harder to enforce, because you have, violent radicalized people that are willing to bust windows and such. And now you have, businesses that are like, yeah, but we know what that the science says to wearing your mask. I don't know what to say. I don't think that showing your vaccine passport was such a big deal in a pandemic. Like, these pandemics last for like 5 years, so we're not even halfway through, and people couldn't be bothered. And and they don't understand simple science. Oh, well, people with the vaccines who got the COVID. I'm like, yeah, because there were variants, because there were so many people who didn't get the vaccine, and like globally, let alone locally. So it's so hard to even have a reasonable conversation with folks that are committed to anti-science views.
The divisiveness, yeah, has been quite almost heartbreaking to watch. I've lost several friends. I lost one friend of over 10 years that just is not in favor of vaccinations or mandates, and they're welcome to their view, but the hostility that comes with it is just too much. This whole, well, the old joke that we always wonder how we do in a zombie apocalypse, and all you were asked to do here was get vaccinated and wear a mask.
Yeah, I never saw all of this coming, and I was really surprised that people couldn't be bothered to wear a mask. But again, it shows the incredible disparity between the two communities of non-Indigenous to Indigenous. Of course, they're not affected. I had a conversation with someone. So when I had my daughter, a lot of mommy groups and such, and I had this conversation with this one friend, and she was certain we couldn't be friends anymore. And I'm like, okay, call me. So we spoke together for the first time in years. She had moved to Saskatchewan, and so I was still stuck here, and we were talking about different things. And she's like, well, I guess we're not that far away from each other. I'm like, yeah. But the thing that came very clear was that she hasn't been affected in any capacity by COVID, other than the restrictions. Whereas, like, I've had uncles die, the community is suffering, I'm suffering financially, let alone other people in my community. Like, we are easily showing two completely different worlds of Canada. And despite all the conversation about reconciliation, there hasn't been the investment into, like you were talking about, paper policies. I mean, Gender Equity Plus and those budgets are really important to me, but really, like, we are seeing a huge difference between one to the other. Ironically, that CBC reporter who said what he said, and the morning guy was like, oh yeah. Ironically, the next segment they had was three single moms talking about their experience in this pandemic, and utterly heartbreaking listening to their struggles. And there's, like, the unpaid labor women give has been long standing, long talked about, but at the end of the day, we're still not acknowledged for the work that we do. And it was so awful to listen to what the single moms were going through. And for a whole bunch of conservative rhetoric of how pro-life they are and pro-family they are, they certainly don't help single parents at all. And my dad to this day is convinced that he was attacked by child welfare when my parents were divorcing. But I said, but Dad, it's because you married a native and had native kids. That's why. And he's still, that's not it. They don't listen to white men like you think they do. And I'm like, Dad, you've never been targeted. If you would have had white children, you would have never been targeted, but you had native kids, and that's why you were targeted. And he's not sure about that. Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I'm like, okay, well, okay. You can't rationalize with that guy. So, well, on certain subjects, but ironically, he thinks, despite all of this, you know, knowing what actual fascism is, he still thinks that the governments are being fascist. And I'm like, this isn't fascism. There's not police knocking on your door, shoving a vaccine in your arm. This is like, that is not happening.
All they ask was that you stay home if you're not vaccinated, stay home if you're vaccinated and you're showing symptoms.
Right.
Wear a mask when you go out. At what
and people
point?
aren't caring about that. They're not wearing a mask anyway. You know, they're not. So
No.
I don't know what to say. I feel pretty stupid even myself though, is you know, watching the Olympics and seeing our Olympians wearing masks at the peak of their
women's team, yeah.
At the peak of their hard work. And I'm like having a hard time going up and down the sea train platform with my mask on.
There's a reason you and I aren't there. We're here watching.
Right? Man, they kick my butt, let me tell you. So yeah, I was pretty surprised with but it's not just them, like lots of the Olympians are wearing masks while performing, like their high performance. And I'm like, oh, man, like that's inspiring, seeing our athletes still wearing their masks despite the insanity around them, and not letting that be the thing that, you know, stops their performance, their you know, athleticism. Like they're so inspiring, and that, you know, that just makes me look down so much more. These freedom convoyers, like I'm like, man, do you know how stupid you sound? Like literally wearing a mask. Once upon a time, scientists and doctors didn't know wearing a mask reduced those things, and we had like the Black Plague and the Spanish flu, all of these different pandemics, and just wearing a mask helps everybody, and that was too much to ask for the privilege.
And another thing that was never, or is undervalued, is the speed at which our federal government, I should say, moved. The criticism of restrictions changing. Well, we've never dealt with this before. Of course, things are going to change. We're always working with the best information we have available. And yes, things do change. Different strains come out, and we've got to be able to roll with it. And it's about keeping your friends, your family, and your neighbors safe. And
ironically, I found it was, again, Jason Kenney and the provincial government that became the barriers for any of the positive actions that were happening federally. You know, and so the Indigenous community and the health community advocated for Indigenous to be one of the highest priority for vaccination. And if it wasn't for this government listening, like Mark Miller and Carolyn Bennett, for, you know, the faults that they have on maybe some of the governance structure, at the end of the day, they listened and agreed, and we were highest priority, which matters because we are going through the genocide again through this pandemic in a different way than the regular genocide that Indigenous face through Canada. And a reminder to folks listening, during the Spanish flu, they actually shut down governments. They just shut them down. They're just like, okay, we're done until after the pandemic. There was no guidance. So, and then to see our elected officials, you know, going to Hawaii, going to Mexico, like it was such a slap in the face.
What are you thinking?
It was such a slap in the face. I mean, a lot of us can't even afford to take time off now, let alone, you know, jump down to, you know, a vacation. And ironically, I guess Justin, while he was recovering from COVID, he went skiing in Quebec, and like the conservatives are totally blasting him for it. And I'm just like, your own people went to freaking Mexico, went to Hawaii. Like we had Hawaii Gate as a stupid hashtag. And you're really getting on him for going to a ski resort by his house? Like, I don't know Jason Kenney has ever vacationed in Alberta, ever. Like, there's no other place that I've.
Well, nobody knew that he lived here until he became premier.
It's true. No, I know, it's true. And then the whole scandal about him using his like mom's seniors lodge basement as a staging, that was like, it was a funny joke, but it's not funny because, you know, when I ran municipally, one of the first questions that was asked at the door, well, do you live in the riding? Yeah, I've lived in the riding since 2005. And, or I guess like it would be the ward here when talking about municipal politics. Anyway, it didn't matter when it came to voting. It didn't matter. And doesn't matter that, Jason Kenney basically lives in Ottawa. He wins by a landslide here all the time. So it's so hard because people are so hypocritical in their ideology when it comes to certain things. And at the end of the day, we have an Easterner running the province with the stereotype that he thinks the province should be run by. When that's, I don't find most Albertans to be that unreasonable. Usually, if you call them out on things, they'll in the end agree, or at least have dialogue. But now we're just seeing, he blocks everybody. He won't even have dialogue with people. He won't hear other opinions from people who have been here. And that's what's really frustrating for me, is that you can't even have dialogue. I mean, I've seen that federally, which is why I became a federal liberal, but you know they won't even return phone calls here. They don't need to. They don't have to. They'll win.
I do think that Alberta is a lot more progressive than it's given credit for.
Yep.
I think after, honestly, decades of conservatives being elected and re-elected, I think there comes that level of fatigue. Is it worth fighting for? Is it worth fighting against? Is it worth? And I think over the next, I would like to say, hopefully by the next election, probably take a bit longer than that, I think we will start to see more progressive voices in Alberta. Hopefully in our lifetimes. And I think as younger people become of voting age and mature and grow up, I think we will see a definite shift. The racism, the homophobia and such is I'm not saying it'll ever go away, but hopefully in the next few decades that starts to come down and be less prevalent in our society. I know the work that you and many other great advocates do contribute to that. What it really comes down to is people educating themselves. And like you always post, it's not your duty to use Google. Do your research, Google, and educate yourself. There's so much room for progress in all ages. I've been overwhelmed by the progress I've seen in some very senior residents of Lethbridge that came up to me after conversion therapy was banned to thank me, that they've followed it for years. He said, my daughter's a lesbian, and so you have no idea what that meant to me. And just Southern Alberta, someone well over the age of 80 years old to come up and shake my hand and thank me for that we've got a lot more support. And I think it's just a matter of people need to use their voice and be an ally and step up. It shouldn't always be you having to fight for these things, right?
Yeah, but I will say, I think that Canadians need to understand how hurtful and insulting it is to tell Indigenous people this isn't who we are, because it is who you are. It has been who you are for years and years. And, people's idea of allyship has been really, really difficult for folks to swallow who are actually oppressed. And I hope that that's the shift that we see, like you're talking about in the next, rather than performative, that it's actual like systemic changes.
While I rail for more accessibility as far as petitions and such, at the same time, I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it. My article in the Knock Knock blog that went out at the end of January there, I do take issue with people's advocacy being limited to Facebook. I do take issue with it being limited to online and behind a screen. Yeah. Obviously, behind a screen doesn't count if you're participating in policy and advocacy, but just what you post on Facebook, setting a black square as your profile picture, it really doesn't do anything. It does not benefit anyone. Sure, it looks good, but unless that's followed up with concrete action, concrete support, people have different strengths. Some people have a strong voice. Some people don't, but have that ability to donate financially. And
Yeah.
it's not a one size fits all. Not everyone can or is able to do the same things. Not everyone's in a safe enough space to speak out. But what I would say is I would encourage everyone to step up and do what you can, and surround yourself with people and groups that will make it safe to speak out, and do what you can. There's safety in numbers, and I think we've both had very distasteful interactions with allies on both sides of our advocacy, and it's
true. Yeah,
definitely a lot to relate to. Another interesting thing that we were talking about last night, my wife found the Calgary Public Library actually did a screening of a documentary shot largely just outside Lethbridge. Esther Tailfeathers featured heavily in that. I can't remember the name of the documentary off the top.
It's about empathy. It's the Blackfoot term for empathy on the opioid crisis.
It was very well done.
Yeah, I seen it in Lethbridge.
Did you?
I seen it in Lethbridge, and you and Miranda were busy that night because I know I invited you. But when I got there, of course, it was basically like all Blackfoot people there when we were all watching it together. So it was actually really like the only way it would have been better is it actually at the Blood Tribe to have watched it. But honestly, it was like the Blood Tribe was all in Lethbridge anyway, so it worked out really well. But it was honestly, it was just it was wonderful to watch it. Yeah. I think it's just hard because it's the opioid crisis. Like when I open up my Facebook, that's what I see. Between COVID and the opioid crisis, it's just taking our people. And as much as you tell people, like, they don't get it, they don't see it, they don't see what we see, and the amount of funerals that people are going to. I actually been like, a friend of ours just lost their grandma, and so they're going to Manitoba, and it's just so hard because it's constant friends, it's constant family. And anyway, the point of this movie was to really highlight it and to show basically the darkest part of colonialism and what it's done.
Absolutely. And I think that's the big difference on policy, and why you and I ended up on the same side of the political spectrum is, and you referenced this earlier today, just kind of that money. And on the right, you have to save money. We don't pay for drugs for people without realizing that preventative aspect. We're saving our healthcare by providing substitutes, by helping people get off addictions, or to wean away from it, whatever supports that individual needs. And between COVID and the opioid epidemic, I think it's a real wake-up call for Albertans. We have a lot to do to step up, really across Canada. You and I ran provincially on a platform of declaring a public health state of emergency due to the opioid epidemic. And I still feel strongly about that. I still think there's a lot to do. And I just don't think we're getting there as quickly as we need to with a government that continues to move regressive policies and ask for your Alberta healthcare number to use a supervised consumption site.
Right. It's really incredible to me, the barriers that are against Indigenous people. And that wasn't even highlighted in that movie. And I couldn't help but think, because Dr. Esther Tailfeathers runs a methadone clinic, and the humanity that she tries to give to that. And what I was thinking of Corey Ashley and Lillian Ashley. You referenced them earlier, how you cried listening to Corey talk about that. And I couldn't help but think, like, if Esther would have been in that Hannah hospital, how different this outcome would be. Lillian would be here for sure. And, we'd be having a very different conversation about that situation. But anyway, I just wish non-Indigenous understood the problems. And ironically, the opioid crisis was pushed by the pharmaceutical companies through the doctors. And there are lots of white people and settler people dealing with addiction issues because they don't really have a proper weaning system when it comes to opioids. So I give out naloxone and Narcans like candy, and especially when I was taking the stupid C train, all of our homeless population in the um, Marlboro C train, it's utterly heartbreaking. All of them impacted by Indian residential schools, all of them. And I don't know. I don't know. We still can't get appropriate services that talk about colonial trauma created by the state, culturally relative support systems where you're allowed to smudge in buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's just, and that was what I was trying to work on before the pandemic. But, obviously so much has changed in my life and my ability to be able to do more. And ironically, like some of these groups, they're so mean in how they are. And I'm like, if you're the advocates for, anti opioid addiction, for services for harm reduction, and you talk to me like this, I can't imagine how you're treating our street people that are, impacted by Indian residential school. You don't know how to talk to natives in any capacity. So I'm so concerned about, where our people are going. I'm grateful Bear Clan finally is going. When I worked for 12th Community Safety Initiative, we tried to get more patrol walks going, but you couldn't get buy-in at that time, and it was such a pro. I don't know. The white supremacy is so insidious that people don't even see that they're busy doing it. So I was really glad when Bear Clan kind of became a thing, but it was, the pandemics made it more difficult for folks, the original founders, to necessarily continue doing that work too. How do you do it? I mean, I'm struggling. I can't imagine how other people are doing too. So anyway, I could go on and on. I hope that we kind of talked about some of the things we wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, I feel like it just got better the longer it went.
That's good.
I'm really glad that we had the Sage Clan here that stepped up, and they were featured a little bit in that documentary, and they've been doing good work for quite some time. And
can I tell you something that really scared me when I was in Lethbridge?
Yeah, for sure.
Everybody told me that the cops, kids, they have their own gang and they beat up natives all the time. And when I was there, there was something called, I want to say Safe Walk. It was like a red truck with like these decals on it.
The watch.
So I tried to talk to them during the Sisters in Spirit Vigil. And I was like, oh, do you know where Sage Clan is? And they were like, nope. They just didn't even want to acknowledge me as a human being. So I'm like, holy shit, you guys are pricks. So anyway, and I'd finally seen Sage Patrol, so I went over and gave them my Narcan. But I was like, why would you guys be like that? But then I realized that was the group everybody was talking about. And they constantly patrol downtown, but they don't know how to talk to Native people. Is there any way they can lose their funding? Or are they just a bunch of Nazis that are thinking they're doing good in the world?
That's funded through the police department. So through
they're the gang. I wanted to confirm that. They're not nice to Indigenous people. I experienced it firsthand, but I've heard so many secondhand stories. And that really scares me that that's being allowed at all. And if it's being funded through the police, that means it's taxpayer funded. But I mean, we have lots of harmful nonprofits here that operate too. So it's definitely a problem nationally as well. Don't want to take that away. So I'm very concerned about the safety of our people when you have that. Because as you can see with Convoy, the police don't hurt white people. But you can see in the hospitals, our people are constantly disfigured by people who are good people, right?
I think there's a lot of work to be done as far as how we view, for lack of a better word, social services. I talked about this with a veteran friend, and yeah, I'm sure you've got similar stories and experiences. Sending police out on mental health checks is not always the best idea, especially with individuals with PTSD or
another argument to fund mental health. Like that's the irony, is that all of the money we're putting into policing, we should be putting into mental health, and this will literally reduce it.
Yeah, and I believe there's somewhere in Europe that actually, I'm going to have to fact check myself on this one later.
You're thinking Portugal?
No, that maybe that started sending out mental health workers with police, just that police would be that safety backup, but they're sending the mental health provider in to address these situations. I think there's a lot of research that can be done on that. There's a lot of research I'd like to see done on guaranteed basic income. There's a lot of preventative things we can look at that would actually save us in the long run, but because when you're preventing something, you can't quantify it. It does make it a hard sell.
Well, we do have reports and studies to show it. Again, we just don't have leadership to implement it, is really what it comes down to. So it's hard because you can know it, you can know that the solutions are there, but you just don't have, folks in positions of power is willing to do anything because they're obviously run by, not the people, by the lobbyists. I don't know. So it's
and that's why we run.
Yeah. Let's say what we need to say our piece, and then go from there. And obviously the people who vote, they have to decide what they want to do. And it's been interesting watching the convoy and them complaining on Twitter, but not necessarily holding these politicians to account. Anyway, I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions and included cultural safety training, cultural first aid, and almost all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous, people of color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. Thank you, author Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, Alicia Fritkin of heretohelp.bc.ca. They have a great article about what is Indigenous cultural safety and why I should care about it. And I wish it was mandatory that anybody who deals with public has to read this as a call to action 57. Their work and those cultural action tools I've said over hundreds of times on my podcast, so please support Indigenous work like that as part of your reconciliation work and settler understandings. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat it here. Internalized racism and lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and marginalized folks experience by the structure of racism. Donna Bevins has a wonderful article about internalized racism in racialequitytools.org. But also, if you were to just Google information on oppression dynamics and internalized hate, you would find tons of information. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention, American Friends Service Committee. So if www.afsc.org, they have do's and don'ts for bystander intervention. So if you see, a woman being harassed by, a truck convoy, or maybe somebody's mask being ripped off their face by some anti-masker, these are things that you can do. If you see or experience racism, please report it at acttoendracism.ca, 587-507-3838 if that's easier for you. And I'll just for transparency, I posted a picture of where I had to work. I walk by Mawada Armories, and right on 9th there they have a traffic light that has squaw on it. And I took a picture and I posted it, and it hasn't ever been taken down. So even I have to send that to Act to End Racism, and there's a Anti-Hate Alberta website that I want to give it to just for their stats, which I know don't matter and aren't going to ever be looked at anyway, as Devon and I have spoken about endlessly today. But at least I'll do the due diligence before reporting it to 311. And then after I report it to 311, monitoring it to see how long it takes for them to deal with it, even though it's been public for, at least a month now. Indigenous have been talking about our issues, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and in public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties. Listen to politicians and their platforms and policies if they don't recognize the marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus. They're cutting violence prevention programs and services, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay-straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities. Know that your vote to that party directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports about child welfare reform, violence prevention, and now 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. Denying those reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the justice, educational, and health institutions, with multiple reports that say the same things. demand change from election platforms and politicians. And if they don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, and sexism, they literally have zero business running. This should be understood by all parties, local politicians, and community organizations. Lots of articles are available now on how non-Indigenous Canadians can become allies. And I'm just going to say this real quick. The convoy tried to use the terminology "every child matters" when talking about their non-Indigenous children. They also tried to make Orange Shirt Day outside of September 30th, showing their ignorance for TRC, but also the story behind it. I don't know what to say. I want to help people, but so many people are so committed to misunderstanding it. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talked about today, you can call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 1-855-242-3310. You can also go onto their website, hopeforwellness.ca, where they have a texting interaction screen. If more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. Again, a national toll-free 24/7 crisis line for that topic. For non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area and usually a functioning 211, or you can call 833-456-4566. For Indigenous, the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta, ssisa.ca, is a resource for folks that were forced into the foster system thanks to the policies that continue today. Again, Act to End Racism, you can go to their website or text at 587-507-3838. The Trevor Project has lots of resources for LGBTQ2+ youth. You can go to their website of lifevoice.ca and see the many. You have the Trans Lifeline, you have an LGBT youth peer support line, you can text that. And then, of course, the Kids Help Phone at 1-800-668-6868. Violence is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. Every generation has faced it. That's why I started the podcast, to speak freely, without interruption, without tone police, without leadership shaming, without gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear Indigenous opinion, but sure want to tell us theirs. Usually by people who know nothing about Indigenous colonialism, the constant surveillance of Indigenous people, our protests, our vigils, and our rights. And I think that was pretty highlighted with this convoy. Microaggressions, people dealing with internalized racism, gatekeepers, folks who live off the status quo, or people who are just in their trauma. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. I want to say thank you to my ancestors, my granny, my mom, of what strength looks like through your examples. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt. My stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots, and teaching me to be a proud Calgarian. It is through her I'm a second generation proud Calgarian, but I highly recommend people who are non-status or non-native, don't call yourself a native Calgarian. I literally do it to make fun of you. Thank
You've
you,
got
Darth.
the copyright now.
You know how much it has pissed off so many settlers that are racist. I love it. Thank you, Darcy, for producing and editing the show, on top of being my husband, my childhood friend, and the father of our child. You have supported me in my journey on the Red Road and have witnessed decades of racism and sexism into our child who we are blessed to learn from daily. We are so honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and a stronger person. My hope is that one day my daughter and my family will be proud of us discussing these present day issues. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or your questions. I also have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. You can go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts, and you can go onto my social medias and see the pinned posts. And lastly, I want to, give side eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not tradish. And my beautiful cousin responded, or you'd be in my dish. Thanks for listening.